Hey, welcome back. I hope you're having a great day. So today we'll be talking about classical fantasy versus modern fantasy. Which one do I think is better? This is actually a discussion. Go down in the comments below. Tell me which one do you think is better. An example of classical fantasy would be The Lord of the Rings. An example of modern fantasy would be something like Mistborn, okay? Or like Lies of Locke Lamora, books like that. So tell me down in the comments below, which one do you think, of these is better? Let's talk about prose. I hate modern fantasy prose. Oftentimes it reads like a freaking screenplay. Oh, it's very minimal. It's so minimal that entire scenes and entire chapters can be literally just dialogue, or they can be, just few descriptions, or like telling us what is happening. Modern fantasy prose is awful. It is terrible. No author should aspire to such nonsense. I don't care what is the trend. I don't care what is considered normal. I don't care any of your contemporary idiots who have inspired you to write such minimalist prose. I want prose like Robert Jordan, okay? I want prose like Robert Jordan. It needs to have, depth. It needs to have beauty. It needs to have unique images. There has to be effort put into the prose, man. You can't, this is a book. I'm supposed to be immersed in a book. Okay, I hate modern fantasy prose, and that is going to be it. I'll close the page on it. I prefer classical fantasy prose, and I think it's far superior, far better. It's far more, it's way better written. Let's talk about characters next. A point that, oftentimes modern fantasy is far superior at is the characters. The characters in modern fantasy are way better. Some of the best written characters in the history of the genre are more present in modern fantasy, which occupies a period of time which is 1/3 compared to classical fantasy. You have negative character arcs, you have positive character arcs, you have on top of that, you still have flat character arcs. You have combinations of these. You really have combinations of these. For example, you have someone like Dalinar from the Stormlight Archive. He had a positive character arc. He had a negative arc and then a positive arc. And then he has a flat arc because he's trying to teach the world what he learned. He made a mistake, he learned, and he's trying to teach the world. In other words, he was a normal person, he became a monster, he became a prophet, and then he's trying to preach. Like, these are very complex characters that are not oftentimes found in classical fantasy. I'm not saying there is a lack of these characters. You can still find them. It's just that you'll have to dig harder. Like Randall Thor is an example of this. Randall Thor is a very beautifully written character, and the trajectory of his character seems to be a negative character arc. You just have to read a lot of books to get to the actual negative character arc. So, in terms of characters in general, I really do believe that modern fantasy has way better characters. Something that classical fantasy actually did better, and actually did far better, world building. Classical fantasy had world building that was actually far more epic, okay? Number two, like I'm talking about, Lord of the Rings, right? These Eye of the World or The Wheel of Time, these are insanely epic worlds that have such insane scope, it's unbelievable. Another thing is that they were more fantastical. If the genre is fantasy, I want the world to be mostly fantasy driven, okay? I want like magic to be integrated into the economy, into the world, into how the people live, into how the people think, superstitions based around magic, stuff like that. You don't most of the time find stuff like that within modern fantasy. It's a lot of the time highly present in classical fantasy, however. And because of that reason, I genuinely prefer the world building in a lot of classical fantasy stories. Most modern fantasy world building is just interested in being minimalist world building. I am not fond of minimalist world building. Number two, I'm not fond of minimalist fantasy. You know what minimalist fantasy is, but minimalist world building is actually trying to make the world itself built for the purpose of the story. So the author has a premise or a story or something they're trying to tell. The entire world will feel as though it is revolving around the premise, or location, for example, will feel as if they're vapid, empty, no one lives there, but they feel like they were built to serve one function. And that is not true for most living worlds, okay, and for most classical worlds, because you will come across a village in a classical fantasy story, the people will be described. The way they live will be described. You will come to see superstitions, how they live. They might even interact with the protagonists, and the superstitions might even come to affect the journey. Okay? But you don't really find a lot of that in modern fantasy because they do minimalist world building. The author will world build enough for them to tell the story, and then for the rest, they will leave it for, like, you know, essentially implied. But there's nothing there. There is really nothing there. It is implied, but there's nothing there, right? And so I don't like that type of world building. I prefer the world to be built, and then the author writes the story in the world that they have built. And, you know, this is a living world that they've already checked out. So I prefer classical fantasy world building. Now here's something I hate: classical fantasy plot. So in terms of plot, classical fantasy plot is very dull. It is essentially as follows, okay? It is Tolkien-esque copycat, journey-driven, typical structure plot. You will have an introduction, establishment of the current world. For example, you might have, like Narnia, you have, you know, our world, it's very normal, and then a fantastical world, and then journey into the fantastical world, establishing the main plot, which oftentimes revolve around finding something or going to somewhere, etc., etc. It's very beat by beat by beat. In fact, it's so beat by beat, it hurts. It is painful trying to go through another book that is essentially has the same plot as the last book. Modern fantasy is so much better because it's so unpredictable. Number two, it's so unique. It's so unique. The premises of these books are so beautiful. Okay, for example, take Jim Butcher's Dresden Files with Stormfront. It's a wizard in Chicago and he's doing investigations. It's film noir in Chicago with magic sprinkled in, okay? The setting is so unique. The mystery element, it's so unique because there is no journey, okay? There is a journey to find the mystery, or sorry, to figure out the mystery, but there is not necessarily the typical hammer you in the head sort of go from point A to point B to point C. So I hate classical fantasy plot. I really abhor that shit. But I prefer modern fantasy plot. So let's talk about innovation. Okay, this is going to be the tiebreaker because so far we have 2 by 2. What breaks the competition in half is going to be the innovation. In simple words, or to put it in a very simple way, modern fantasy is far more innovative. In fact, as I said, the term of modern fantasy essentially means we don't know what it is. We can't put a finger on it. Why? Because it's so innovative. It jumps every few years. The term modern means now. It's so unpredictable. We essentially called it now fantasy. So you have to understand, modern fantasy is ludicrously innovative. It is essentially, you know, highly subversive. And oftentimes these authors will come up with very unique replacements and very good replacements for what? Tropes and cliches, right? And therefore, ultimately, you end up with a far more innovative, far more interesting, far more just generally better stories, and structurally more risky, but oftentimes better. Because a lot of these authors, they will take insane risk with their structures and they'll come out with a really better story a lot of the time. Sometimes, you know, it goes down the drain. The author ends up being someone too stupid for the ambition, but oftentimes they figure it out. Like a lot of these authors will figure it out. Examples of these are like Scott Lynch, Jim Butcher, as we talked about, Batul Rothfuss. He's a mix between classical and modern fantasy. Brandon Sanderson, how did I forget that guy? He is so structurally unique. N.K. Jemisin is another example. All of these authors, they take structural risks and oftentimes it pays off. It's so brilliant. So I love classical, I love modern fantasy and how far more innovative it is. And this is going to be the tiebreaker. This point is so important to me that it has to be what sets modern fantasy apart from classical fantasy. So tell me what you think. Which one do you prefer, classical fantasy or modern fantasy? I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please consider subscribing. Have a nice day. Bye.